This is Amanda Ray, President of Wild Ones Greater Baltimore. I'm excited to introduce today's speaker, native and invasive plant expert, Judy Fulton. Judy, Master Gardener and Vice President of the Maryland Native Plant Society, is also a co-author of Plant Invaders of Mid-Atlantic Natural Areas Field Guide, a compendium of more than 90 invasive plants of the Mid-Atlantic. She most recently lent her expertise to the Maryland Native Plant Coalition in drafting the Native Plants Program, recently signed into law, one tenet of which will elevate the presence of native plants in nurseries. She serves on the board of the Mid-Atlantic Invasive Plant Council, the Maryland Invasive Species Council, and the Maryland Sierra Club's Natural Places Committee. She also led the creation of the online Mid-Atlantic Invaders Tool by the University of Georgia, a comprehensive database of organisms invasive to our area. Her extensive knowledge and passion for native plants is evident through years of commitment to her community service and her own extensive woodland garden. We hope you enjoy today's talk all about ferns.
All of the stormwater control and other services help to clean up the bay. You don't see in the satellite photos after a storm, it's less likely to see a big plume of soil and chemicals entering the bay. So this really helps with the health of the bay. This here is another picture of Christmas fern. And what's interesting about this fern is it's an evergreen fern. In the growing season, the fronds are somewhat upright, but in winter, they go down onto the ground and they hug the ground. And that's one way that they can help prevent erosion. The ferns are very important in terms of the interactions with our native animals. They provide shelter for birds that are ground nesters, for reptiles, for small mammals. They provide nesting materials, especially the fuzz on fern fronds when they're coming up in the spring. They're eaten by our native animals. They serve as a host plant for certain insects. For instance, this moth here, which is the Osmunda borer. Osmunda is the genus of some of our native ferns, like our royal fern. So I think it's a really, really pretty insect. They provide more humidity under them, and mosses can thrive where they're ferns. And they also have relationships with our beneficial fungi, our mycorrhizal fungi underground. Both the ferns benefit and the actual fungi benefit. So they're very important in terms of the natural interactions and the ecosystems in which they are. This here is a drawing of the food web. Although you can't see it, this is drawn by Amanda, right at the bottom there. And this shows how the various living species interact. At the very bottom is the soil with the decomposers in the soil. And on that grow our plants, including our ferns. This is rather small, probably on your screen, but here are some ferns. These are the primary producers. Now, this is the base here, because a lot of herbivores are dependent on the plants. Well, they're all dependent on the plants. They need the plants to survive and reproduce. That means mammals, it means other insects. There are all sorts of animals that eat our plants. Those are the primary consumers. Secondary consumers can eat both plants and also the primary consumers. And we're here at the top messing up this food web, but also benefiting from it. Why do we want to have ferns around? Well, besides the important interactions with other plants and with animals, they fill a variety of niches, and they grow in a lot of places that other plant species don't like to grow. For instance, they do really well in shady locations. There are wildflowers and trees and shrubs that grow in shady locations, but a majority of them like the more sunny areas. They can grow in wetter, dry locations, and they can even grow on rocks and poor soils where there aren't very many plants. They grow in a couple of different ways. There's some that I call the shy, retiring ones. They're more reserved. They don't do that well with competition. But then there are also others that grow quite aggressively and can spread and colonize a lot of ground. So those that spread readily often will spread in disturbed areas. And important, in Maryland, where a lot of places there are way too many deer, they resist deer browse. They might get eaten a little bit when they're just coming up, when the fronds are just coming up in the spring and they're more tender. But I've never had an issue with my approximately 20 species of ferns being eaten by my local deer. And I can't say that from a majority of my plants. This here is cinnamon fern, and it's called cinnamon fern because of the fronds here, the ones that have the spores on them that are cinnamon colored. Ferns also really improve their habitats in the environment. They improve soils like other plants. They add organic matter. They add soil carbon to the soil and nitrogen. And as I mentioned, they are important for the beneficial fungi, the mycorrhizae. They, like other plants, release oxygen that we breathe. They do that via photosynthesis. And in this day of climate change, they help by sequestering carbon. This here is another fern. It's the one I mentioned on the timeline. This is the 180 million year old interrupted fern. And it's called interrupted fern because the frond is interrupted by these fertile leaflets. This is where the spores are. And at an earlier stage, they look like beautiful little leaves. This is a later stage when they're more mature. And then the fertile fronds, after they've turned brown and released their spores, will drop off and you will see the frond interrupted. So that's where that common name comes from. How about us humans? Well, I've, upon occasion, purchased fiddleheads at the grocery store. The ostrich fern, of which this is a picture, is where those fiddleheads usually are harvested from, and they're considered a great delicacy. The fiddleheads can only be eaten from certain species of fern. And just a warning that you have to prepare fronds correctly or they can be toxic. And in some cases, the species of ferns have more toxic fronds. So just a warning, just don't go out and pick some fronds and eat them. Ferns are also used in medicine. That's not only herbal medicine, but there's some research studies being done for use in modern medicine for heart disease or asthma or rheumatism. The use in modern medicine is really just starting, but I'm keeping an eye on that because that's quite interesting. And of course, one of the reasons that we're all here today is ferns are beautiful additions to landscapes. Are ferns already great? Always great? Well, no. One of our beautiful native ferns is a hay-scented fern. It can do really well in our landscapes and not cause problems, but it can, in certain situations, especially situations in which they're very disturbed habitats, it can cause problems. So, for instance, foresters in Pennsylvania are not very fond of hay-scented fern because they can try to get a better environment for trees. They can remove a whole bunch of invasives, and that disturbs the ground. And it can also bring in more light. And in that disturbed ground, it's not unusual for this aggressive colonizer, this hay-scented fern, to take over. And then once it takes over, it monopolizes resources like light and can interfere with germination of tree seedlings and of other plant seedlings too. Our beautiful native bracken fern, which is another fern that is really circumglobal, is toxic to animals, and it changes the chemistry in the soil, so helps prevent germination of other plants with allelopathy. And once again, it monopolizes resources. This picture here is of the invasive net-veined holly fern. And there are other invasive ferns like autumn fern and painted fern, also known as ghost fern. And those spread and damage the environment by monopolizing resources. But unlike our natives, even our problem native ferns, they really aren't making much of a contribution. So are some of our native ferns bad? No, not really. It's that we have altered the communities, the plant communities, and we have caused them to have imbalances. That's both due to us humans and also due to deer overpopulation, which we're responsible for too. So in a healthy plant community, you're not going to have any of the native ferns causing any problems. But when we disturbed an area a lot, we've got to manage some of our ferns. All right, so I'm going to go here briefly into certain parts of the fern so that this can help with the rest of the presentation when I refer to the ferns by various names. I've already mentioned the fiddlehead. That's the young frond uncurling. And the fern grows from a rhizome or underground stem and there are also roots. Then the blade is this part, as opposed to the whole fern leaf, which includes the stem. This is the blade. And the individual part of the blade is, actually, I should circle here. It's the pinna. So this whole piece here is a pinna. Now, it's worth remembering pinna because I'm going to be using that word a lot. Then an individual piece of the pinna is called a pinule. So that's a division of the pinna. And a pinule can be further divided depending on the fern species. This is the stem, and the stipe is below the blade. The rachis is the stalk within the blade. Now, each fern can have either sterile pinnas, or pinnae is the correct plural, or there can be separate fronds that have the reproductive features, the sori on them. Are there any questions about that? So now we're going to get into identification. And if you look at one, and you don't have to call it up, but you can look at it later, one of my handouts, it's the first word, it's a one-pager. And the first thing that we look at, and that is showing up on this handout, is the leaf shape. So some ferns are broadest at the base. They form a triangle shape with the base being broadest, the broadest part of the fern. This is an example of the bracken fern. Other ferns are fully tapering at the base. So this completely tapers at the top, but then goes down and completely, I just went back. Hold on a second. I'm going, there we go. Don't click your mouse. So this is New York fern. Then there's semi-tapering at the base. It tapers completely at the top, but it's not broadest at the base, and you can see it's a bit more narrow, but it doesn't fully taper. Now, most ferns are this semi-tapering, or at least most ferns in Maryland are semi-tapering. They're the irregularly shaped leaves. This is the northern maidenhair fern, which is just gorgeous. It has these light green blades and this dark stem. And especially, you can especially see it where the blade is. This here is a fern called walking fern. This likes to grow on limestone rocks. And this is almost the only fern you're going to see around here that isn't compound. It's all one piece, and it's sort of arrow shaped. Here you can probably see the arrow shape. This is walking fern, and it's called walking fern because after a frond grows, the tip will touch the rock, and a new frond, a new fern will grow from there. So these are unusual shapes, but these are probably the only two ferns you're going to see in these shapes. Next, the distinguishing feature is how lacy the blade is, or how coarse. So Christmas fern is what's called once cut. Think of the blade as one piece, and then take a pair of scissors and cut into it once, and you will get Christmas fern. On the other hand, with cinnamon fern, here is one pinna, so the single cut goes here, or here, or here, and then it's cut again. So these pinnules are created by cutting it once more. This is thrice cut. This is intermediate fern, or intermediate wood fern. And you can see the first cut is here. The second cut is here. And then the third cut, it doesn't go all the way through, but you can see the third cut is that pinnule is cut once again. So can you see the difference between the once cut, the twice cut, and the thrice cut? Any questions about that? Next, you can look at the spore patterns, or the fertile fronds. This, as I mentioned, is cinnamon fern, and this has separate fertile fronds. This here is Our Lady fern, and they're sterile fronds and fertile fronds, but the fertile fronds look like the sterile fronds. You can see what I call the fruit dots here, which contain the spores. All right. And one way that this is useful for identifying lady fern is it's a herringbone pattern, and the individual sporangi that contain the spores are slightly curved. Think of a lady's eyebrow. This is a fern that grows on rocks called polypody, and here the sporangi are round. This one is ostrich fern, and that also, like cinnamon fern, has a separate fertile frond. Marginal wood fern, that's only one of the common names. It's also called shield fern, or leatherleaf fern. This, I like using the common name marginal wood fern because the sporangi are on the margins of the pinnules. See that? So all of these are good ways to identify ferns. Another way is, how is the fern growing? It can be in a clump, and for the clump, it can either be a very tight clump like this, or a somewhat looser one like Christmas fern. This is ostrich fern. Or it can grow by the rhizomes, or a combination of that, and clumping, but some are really scattered with one leaf per node. And then there's a solitary one leaf per plant, like the walking fern that I showed you. This fern here is our sensitive fern. Another characteristic, if you're out walking in the winter, you can see which ferns are evergreen. This is, again, our Christmas fern. I have a lot of photos of Christmas fern in this, but it's a great example. And also, it's the most common fern in our area. So here you see in the winter, the Christmas fern is still green, and it's laid its fronds down on the ground to help hold the soil. This is sensitive fern, and this is sort of the opposite because it is called sensitive because the first time it gets cold, the fronds die back. But this is the fertile frond of the sensitive fern. So there's a separate fertile frond. And it actually does provide winter interest because it persists through the winter. So if you see this fertile frond and no leaves, no other fronds, no green fronds, you know that it is sensitive fern if you see that in the winter. All right. Here are some resources. I used to have these at the end, but I discovered that I was always in a hurry to finish up at the end, so I now put resources in the middle. This here is a very useful little guide. It's only a few inches tall and wide, and it's quite simple. It's visual. It's called Fern Finder. And after the presentation, Vinny has a copy. You can do that right now. I can see you, Vinny. Why don't you hold up the Fern Finder? And put your hand up closer so they can see sort of over it so they can see how small it is. You can pretty much cover the whole thing with your hand, right?
Yep.
So that's a very useful resource because it's very simple and it's friendly. It doesn't include all the ferns in Maryland, but it does have a majority of our most common ferns. So I like that. If you want to have all our ferns, this is a good guide, the Peterson Field Guide to Ferns. This is about I don't know, 4.5 or 5 inches tall. It's a smaller booklet than it's not full size, but so it's easy to carry around. That's a good resource. You can look up if you have an idea. These are visual guides. If you have an idea what it might be, you could look up the Digital Atlas of Virginia Flora. That's vaplantatlas.org. You can narrow down the possibilities by for common name, if you put in fern, it'll bring up, I think it'll bring up all the ferns then. It'll bring up some extra plants too, like there's a shrub that has nothing to do with ferns, but the common name is sweet fern. So it'll bring that up too, but that's a good start. You can say, well, let me check out this fern. Likewise, with the flora of the southern United States, there's a really big PDF, but online you can put in fern and it will come up with a whole bunch of possibilities. And there is a phone app called FloraQuest, which just came out in May or June. You can look up a fern. Oh, and these ferns, by the way, these resources, the Digital Atlas and the Flora of the Southern United States, or its app, will let you know whether a fern is native here. So if you're at a nursery, you can look up a fern and see whether, yes, I want to put that into my landscaping, it's native. Likewise, you can look up Bonap. Now, Bonap isn't as reliable as the digital atlas of the Virginia flora or the flora of the United States. And there's also the Flora of Virginia along with an app. And those are great for determining nativity. This here is easy to use. This is Bonap. And you want to look at it, if you're going to use it, you want to look at it by county and look for light green. If it's not light green, it isn't native. So sometimes people use the USD plants website, and that is less reliable than all of these. Where do our ferns grow? Well, I mentioned that they like different moisture and light combinations. They might like wet areas or medium wet areas, or moist, I should say, or dry areas. Those are all, some ferns always are in the shade. Other ferns like wet areas, but they can grow in either shade or sun. And then there are very few that actually can grow in dry sun. Sometimes the ferns are not particular at all about pH, but others want to grow in more acidic soil or sweeter soil. I mentioned again, the walking fern likes to grow on limestone because that is sweeter, the little bit of soil that's there. The soil types could be very rich woodland soils or other rich soils, all the way to poor soils. And then all different types of soils. So they can grow in sand, they can grow in clay or loam, which is a combination of sand and clay and silt. They can grow on wood, and some of them can grow on rocks. I showed you the polypody earlier. Those you're only going to find on rocks. This here is a fern that's very dependent on mycorrhizae. This is a cutleaf great fern. This is interesting because the frond disappears in the summer and comes out in the fall and then persists over the winter. This is a very small fern. And this is interesting because this is one of the ferns that is totally dependent on those underground fungi. In fact, the great ferns can go for years without sending up a frond because they're living off of the mycorrhizae underground. So I'm going to go through some ferns now. First of all, I'm going to focus on evergreen ferns. These are woodland ferns for the most part. They are clumpers, and they don't spread aggressively. Those are the smaller evergreen ferns. The larger of those are, they provide ground cover, of course, throughout the year because they're evergreen. And so they're good against erosion. And they generally prefer humus in the soil, medium to dry soil, and well-drained soil. So if you've got a wet area, the rhizomes and the roots will rot. Then there are smaller evergreen ferns, and I mean really quite smaller. And those provide interesting accents, but I wouldn't say that they're ground covers. They often prefer rocky areas. This here is the marginal wood fern. If you remember, that's got the sporangia right on the margins of the pinnules, but that would be on the other side. This is the top. They'd be on the bottom. This is one of my favorite ferns. It is twice cut. It's a blue-green fern, but this is just it's not this gray generally. It's just due to the light when I took this picture. But it's a beautiful, beautiful fern. And it likes medium moisture, but once it's established, it does just fine with drought. Here's another couple of pictures of the marginal wood fern. Again, you can see it's a clumper. It's a fairly tight clump. And here are the fruit dots on the margins of the leaves, of the pinnules. This is intermediate wood fern. This is thrice cut. And it is also called fancy fern because it is so delicate with the being thrice cut. Here's another picture of the fancy fern and in the rain. So you can tell I didn't take this picture recently since we haven't really had much rain. It was about 3 years ago I took it. Now, here you can see more clearly that it's thrice cut. So the first cut is here. The second cut is here. And then there are additional cuts here. These fruit dots, in contrast to the marginal wood fern, are not on the margins. They're closer to the central vein on the pinnule. They also have this white center. And this also likes medium moisture. Once again, there's Christmas fern. This is a looser clump, but it's still a clump. And this does not have separate fertile fronds, but the pinnules look different. So this frond here has both sterile pinnae and fertile pinnae. You can see the sterile pinnae are larger and longer, and the fertile ones are much thinner and shorter. So this particular frond has both. This frond here, you don't see those reduced pinnae. So this is completely sterile, this frond. And if you turn it over, this is where the spores are growing, inside here. And this is, since it's only once cut, so it's much coarser looking than, for instance, the fancy fern or even the marginal wood fern. Once again, it prefers medium moisture. It cannot take wet ground, but it's extremely drought tolerant. These are the young fronds coming up. And I mentioned how birds can use the hairs on these as they're coming up, and you can see all these delicate white hairs that can go in a bird's nest. So this is one of the ferns where that can occur. So those were 3 medium-sized, the larger evergreen ferns. This is a more delicate fern. It's much smaller. It's called ebony spleenwort. It's called ebony because the stem here is an ebony color. It is once cut like Christmas fern, and it is tapering at both ends. You can see that. And here are the fruit dots. It's a beautiful little fern, an accent fern. This is polypody, and it likes to grow on cliffs, as I mentioned before. Here are the fruit dots. It sort of is zigzag with the fronds. First, there's one pinna, and then there's another pinna, and on the other side, the pinna grows alternating, so between. And you can see it growing on rocks here. Love this fern, but then it's very hard for you to show me a fern that's native that I don't love. Those were the evergreen ferns that you're going to see most often. Here are the some of the deciduous ferns. They're woodland ferns. They're either clumping or spreading. Some are aggressive, and they're either lacy or some of them are more coarse. This is lady fern. Some of the stems are red, and some are greener.
Judy, we have a question, if I can cut in. From Vinny, how to tell when a cut is actually a cut and not just a serrated margin on a pinna or a pinule?
Mostly experience. No, if it's wavy, it doesn't count as a cut. It has to be a little jagged. And the thrice cut is the most difficult because you can tell once cut, you can tell twice cut, because it pretty much goes into the center vein. But the thrice cut is often not into the center vein. So I'd say look for it being a little jagged. Does that answer your question, Vinny?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's still, I'm figuring that it's based on experience, because there are sometimes it feels like it's 3 times cut, but sometimes it's not. So I think you answered my question. Experience is what I need.
So this here is as I said, a lady fern. And this, it does kind of clump, but it also kind of spreads. So it can be, lady fern is one of the harder ones to ID. It's also, and this really gets into what Vinny is saying, it's also, sometimes it looks more thrice cut, and sometimes it looks a little bit more like it's twice cut. So this can be hard to ID. Here's another picture, and you can see it clumping here, but it's a really loose clump. Of the best ways to tell lady fern is those curving lady's eyebrows for the fertile fronds. The other thing is, and I can't really see it here so much, but the bottom pinnae, that couple of bottom pinnae really form a V. So look for a V. But that said, there are other ferns that have a V at the bottom too. but that's one of the characteristics. If it's got the reddish stems, that's another way to tell. But again, I think that the lady ferns are a little difficult unless I can see the fruit dots.
Okay, Judy, we have a question.
Yep.
From Tayri. Is lady fern aggressive since it clumps but also spreads?
I would say it's medium. If you have it in the wrong place, it's not aggressive at all. And it's definitely less aggressive than other ferns, but it's more aggressive than something like marginal wood fern or fancy fern. That's a good question. This here again is the northern maidenhair fern. It's deciduous. It likes slightly more moist areas. It's wonderful in providing contrast with other plants. And you're not going to mistake it for other ferns. The spores come from the edges of the pinnae. The edges curl over, and that's where the spores are. So it kind of looks like it's turning brown, but no, it's supposed to look like that. And it's just gorgeous. Look at that light green and the dark stems and the circular shapes. Now, this is New York fern, and this is an aggressive spreader. This likes medium moisture. This is fully tapering, as in the picture I had before where there was a single frond. Let me see. I'm trying to see. Now, I don't have a good example of a single frond here. It was up earlier. Here's a good one. You can see fully tapering here and fully tapering at the base. And the way to remember this is it's like New Yorkers who party at all hours and burn the candle at both ends. It is a twice cut fern. And here are the sporangi. But really, the best way to tell New York fern is not difficult to ID because it's a medium-sized to smaller fern that tapers at both ends. And I don't think there's any other Maryland fern that fits that description. This can grow really in quite moist areas. On the other hand, hay-scented fern, which is really the most aggressive of the ferns now, except that I've mentioned, except for bracken fern. This is the one that the Pennsylvania foresters don't like. It is a real spreader. It is thrice cut. And here it is in one of the places it grows naturally in a hemlock forest. It can deal with very dry soil. And there you can see it's thrice cut. Once, twice, and then these notches here. And here are the fruit dots. They're all closer to the stem along the notches. See where they're located? And this, as you can tell, is just spreading all over. Over some wet soil ferns or ferns that will even grow in water. A lot of them have showy fertile fronds that will persist through the winter, and separate deciduous sterile fronds. In many cases, they're perfectly okay if they're in water. And they can deal with sun, but only if the conditions are wet enough. These fall both into the aggressive spreader category, or they can be more restrained. This here is ostrich fern, and you can see here with the reflection of water. So it's very wet here. Now, ostrich fern is not native in a lot of locations in Maryland. So, for instance, here in Baltimore County and Howard County, in central Maryland, I don't think there's a single location where this fern grows naturally. But it does grow, for instance, I've seen it growing naturally on the Potomac. And it grows on, I'm blanking on it, the big river that comes in at the top of the bay, with the dam. What's it called? It begins with an S. Well,
Susquehanna?
Yes, thank you. It grows there. So here is ostrich fern. And these brownish things sticking up are the fertile fronds. These deciduous leaves will die back. This is the tightest clumper, and it fully tapers to the base. So I've only dealt with three ferns now that completely taper to the base. One is this, and this is a larger fern, so you're not going to mistake it for New York fern. But like New York fern, it's twice cut. Then there's the smaller New York fern. This, of course, is it forms a tight crown. The New York fern is a spreader. And I also mentioned ebony spleenwort, and that's once cut, and it's smaller and thinner than both of these other ferns. This is cinnamon fern with that gorgeous fertile frond. Now, as opposed to ostrich fern, this does not persist. So my cinnamon ferns have already had their fertile frond, and you can't even see the fertile fronds anymore. This is twice cut. You can see that here. And here, once again, see how fuzzy it is? Think bird nest. And this is cinnamon again. I already showed the fruit dots on this one. I'm sorry, not the fruit dots. I already showed the underside on this one. And what's interesting, and a very good way to ID it once it is no longer has that fertile cinnamon colored frond, is there are little bits of cinnamon colored fuzz where the pinnae join the stem on the underside.
Judy, I'm going to interrupt real quick.
Yeah.
We have a couple questions one from Jimmy. Any tips for identifying cinnamon ferns when the fronds aren't present?
When they're not, you mean the fertile fronds aren't present? Those fuzzy things. Let me go back because there's a good picture.
And then we have a question after this too.
All right. So here is the underside of cinnamon fern. And this is an unmistakable ID characteristic. This is fuzz right here. And it's
Judy, we're having a little difficulty hearing you. There's a little bit of interference.
Okay, I'll try that again. Here is the cinnamon colored fuzz, where each pinna joins the stem on the underside. And that's a very good ID feature. Now, before it senesces, before the fronds disappear in the fall, this can get to the point where a lot of the fuzz has come off and it might not be as obvious. But right now, and for several months, this is a really good way to tell the difference between cinnamon fern and other ferns. What's the other question?
The other question was about the nativity of the ostrich fern from Cheryl Thurber. She said she saw it near the Patapsco River and in her woods. She lives in Catonsville area. So she was asking about it. You're saying it not being native, but I think you did say that. Didn't you say you'd seen it near the Patapsco?
Potomac.
Potomac. Okay. Yeah. So she was asking why you were saying it wasn't native to Baltimore County.
Well, I will, I can look that up after I finish with this presentation because I don't want to interrupt the presentation. It's possible it's near there.
Okay, great. Thank you.
That's a possibility. The other possibility is sometimes people plant ostrich fern in what looks like a wild area. So it could be actually native there, or it could be someone put it there. But I'll check into that. This is another fern that likes wet soils. It's a tough spreader. It does not clump. It is sensitive fern, and I've already shown that to you. Look at it growing in a really wet area here. And this is a close-up of the fertile frond. It's like beads. It's really cool. And this is often it's wider at the base. And it is either, excuse me, it is either once cut, like at the top, or towards the base, it's twice cut. You see that difference there? So triangular, broadest at the base, twice cut here, once cut here. And it's a tough fern, so it loves wetter areas, but it'll also grow in medium moisture areas. This is a lovely fern called royal fern. And remember that insect I showed you, and the first part of its name was Osmunda. Well, this is in that genus. And the first time I saw this fern, I mistook it for a shrub. because it kind of looks like a shrub with separate leaves and leaflets. This is another fern where the fertile pinnae are at the tops of the frond. So there's sterile pinnae below, and then fertile pinnae on top of some of the fronds. This is the fertile. This is less ripe, and this is more ripe. And this is thrice cut, because this is part of one frond, and then it branches off, and then it's cut again. And here you can see it. This is once cut, twice cut. And that it's thrice cut. I didn't do that correctly. I think there can be several, what looks like several branches. So this is one branch here. But gorgeous. This is an interesting fern. This is hairy lip fern. And it grows on rocks in the sun. And it is just really cool. So I don't know whether you can see with how small your pictures probably are, but that common name, hairy lip fern, there are hairs here.
Okay, Judy, we have one more question from
Yep.
Carla. How do we tell when a fertile frond is mature enough to spread spore? Thinking of the separate fertile fronds, especially like cinnamon or sensitive.
That's a good question. Well, for one, you can tap it. And if spores come out, it's ready. They tend to be brown. They change colors from like lighter to darker. It's one of those things that you could take for instance, a white piece of paper and hold the frond over the white piece of paper and tap it and see whether spores are coming out. That's the best way. It's kind of you know it when you see it, but it's hard to determine, and the spores on different species mature at different times.
Thank you.
So here you can see the spores here. It covers pretty much the entire underside when they're fertile pinnae. And here it is growing on rocks. So this does fine with just a little bit of soil on top of rocks. It'll often grow on cliffs. And I've only once seen this fern for sale. And I immediately grabbed it and got some. Now, a lot of us have problems with invasives. So there's some ferns that do quite well fighting invasives because they're really tough and they're spreaders. And there are others that aren't great because they're not as aggressive. If you want a fern that's going to be defeating invasives, you have to get one that's a competitor that colonizes disturbed habitats. Often they're called thugs, these native ferns. Example is, as I mentioned, the hay-scented fern. And for years, I did not want to get hay-scented fern because I said, I don't want that aggressive a fern. I don't want it taking over. And then I realized I live on a hill, and uphill from me, there was a neighbor who didn't maintain their property, and it was just covered with invasives. So I finally said to myself, I might as well get this really aggressive fern and put it in and use it to help keep the invasives off. These aggressive ferns can compete because they reproduce quickly and spread, so they can crowd out the invasives. Because they spread so much, they can shade out seedlings and interfere with seed germination. And then some of the ferns, I mentioned the bracken fern, and this is an example of bracken fern, changes the soil chemistry so it's less friendly for its other plants. One of the reasons that our native plants of all types, like our wildflowers, don't do so well against invasives is because of deer. And deer, since they co-evolve with our natives, will tend to eat our wildflowers. On the other hand, they tend not to eat our ferns, and that helps the ferns compete against invasive plants.
On behalf of the board of Wild Ones Greater Baltimore, we hope that you enjoyed this talk and will consider becoming a member to support future talks. A big thank you goes out to Vinaya Frank, who's our Vice President and Programs Chair, Ann Neo, our Marketing Chair and Secretary, Karen Shaven, our Membership Chair, and April Kearns, our Treasurer. We hope that you will tune in again for our next talk.